Hey everyone, it is time for another recitation, this time on the shopping cart context project. So, I already have my project cloned and installed, and we're ready to go. So, inside of my source folder, we can take a look at app.js, and someone used tabs instead of spaces for indenting their code. So I'm gonna have to fix that in all of the files. Um, but the basic goal is instead of using the prompts that we pass to our product component and the shopping cart component and navigation, we would rather share all of that information via context. The scope of this project is pretty limited, so we don't actually gain that much from using context. Normally, you'd want to use context with situations to avoid prop drilling with information we're not going to be using at many of the levels, perhaps with theming information, or when we want to kind of disconnect some of our components from the the linear method of passing props down. You know, if we want to share some data laterally across things, we can do that without necessarily centralizing it inside of some higher level component and then passing that down. So our first step is we want to create our context. Let me get us zoomed in, and let's make our context. I'm going to create a folder called contexts, and in here I'm going to create a file called product context.js. Oh, it looks like my editor already has the solution for this cached, but we're going to delete this. We're going to import React from React. We're going to create a variable called product context. And we're going to call, yes, this is being recorded. We are going to call react.createContext. And that's going to create a context for us. And we can also export this. I could have done this all on one line, but I don't care about being a little bit more explicit. Some of you may have imported create context with a named import. That's absolutely fine. We can also give a default value to create context here, but I'm not going to. You don't have to give a default value for your context because you should always be specifying the value when you use it as a provider, which is our next step. Inside of app.js, we want to provide our context. So we're going to import our context, make a nice little section for it. So I'm going to import my product context from /contexts product context.js. And now I can provide all of that to my existing components by making a component called product context.provider. And I'm just wrapping my entire existing JSX in this, which I'm absolutely allowed to do. And now I need to specify the initial value for this context. In this case, I want to provide, with the product context, I want to provide the products. And I can do that inside of an object, inside of the value, and we get this kind of weird looking syntax where we have these double set of curly braces. The first one is to get ourselves an environment where we can run JavaScript inside of our JSX, and the second one is to create an object. And my variable is called products. I could do it like this, where I have a key called products and a value of products, but if the variable is the same name that we want the key, then we can omit that when we are declaring the variable. So that is what I'm doing here. Now I can consume this context inside of any of my components that make use of the products and work with it there. I also want to add this add item function. Or wait, no, I do that with the cart context, right? Yeah. Oh no, that is with the product context. Never mind. So I'm also gonna add this add item function to my product context. And add item is a variable. It happens to contain a function, but it is a variable. We declared it with const. It would also work if you declared it with the function syntax as well, because that produces a variable. So then I can remove these from products because I am not going to use them anymore. In fact, I can remove this entire render prop because now that I'm not passing any component to products, I'm sorry, now that I'm not passing any props to product, I can just add it as the component to my route. I no longer need this render prop. The problem is, if we go and check on our React app, it's very mad at me for removing those props without specifying their replacements. So that is what I'm about to do. So we just modified the way we're rendering products. So let's take a look at that component. So I'm going to go into the components directory. I'm going to find products.js. We're going to reformat this file real quickly. And we're going to find that we are trying to use the props that previously we were being given. But I've now decided to share those with this component via my context, via the value on this provider. And I can do this using the consumer method that we saw in class and we're often going to see in legacy code. But since we're using functional components with hooks, it is much cleaner to just import the use context hook and do it that way. We're also going to need to import the context that we want to use. So I'm going to add a section for that, and I'm going to import product context from this time ... because now I'm in the components directory. I want to go up a level and then back into the contexts directory. So now I have that imported. I can call useContext and give it the product context, which is the context that I want to consume here, and then I can capture its output. This is going to give us back the value object that we added as a prop to our provider, which I am totally allowed to use. In fact, I could replace props with value here and here, and it works. But more commonly, we're going to see this be destructured in line the same way that we destructure the return values from useState, and the same way we destructure props inside of the argument list. Since this is an object, I'm going to use my object destructuring, and I'm just going to get products and add item into their own variables, and now I can remove the object in front of those values. So now we're just mapping directly over the products variable, and we're passing down the add item function inside of its own variable as well. And we can check and make sure that works. Ah, there we go. Our cart incremented. The recording can't see that. Now they can. Ooh, look at that. We're also going to fix the fact that you can add the same book to your cart as many times as you want, just for kicks. Okay, so do we have any questions here? And out of paranoia, I'm going to check my zoom levels. Okay, zoom is good. If you're talking, I should be hearing you. Alright, no questions so far? Great. Then we're going to keep going. Our next step is going to be to provide the context for the remainder of our components. This time, cart. We're passing cart as a prop to shopping cart and also to navigation. We're going to remove that and instead use context. So we're going to follow the exact same process that we did for product context. I'm going to go into my contexts folder. I'm going to create a file called cartcontext.js, And my text editor has it cached from when I did the solution to this yesterday, but it's the exact same process. We import React, we create our context, and then we export it. Here, I'm going to import that context into app.js. I'm just going to do that with a little find replace on product. Now I have my cart context, and I'm going to provide it as well. So cart context dot provider, and the value is now going to be equal to, again, an object. I'm going to add cart to this, and then I am going to close my provider at the end of my component. So now I have my cart context also being provided. So I should be able to now remove the props from navigation. And in doing so, we should get an error because the value of that prop is no longer defined and navigation is still using it. So we're going to need to check out the implementation of navigation and change it to use context. So I'm going to import my use context hook. I am going to get the value by calling use context. I need to pass the context that I want to consume as an argument to use context. So in order to do that, I need to import it. So import cart context from ... I want to go up a level and then down into context and then cart context. So now I can pass that as the argument to my cart context. And I like to structuring this in line, so I'm just going to get my cart out of that object. And now I can remove props.cart because now cart is just in its own variable. And there we go. And if I add items to the cart, it works. But now, using context. So, I want to do the same thing for my shopping cart. I can remove the render completely and just add the shopping cart as the component to my route. When I save this, I'm going to get errors because I no longer have that defined. When I click on my shopping cart, React gets mad at me. Props.cart is undefined. So let's go ahead and fix that. I'm going to check out my shopping cart component. I'm going to fix the formatting. And I'm going to import the context that I want to use. I want to import use context from React. And then I want to make use of my context. So I'm going to get the value from that context by calling use context and giving cart context to it as an argument. And I'm going to destructure that in line because that's what I like doing. So now I have cart in its own variable from that context. And now I need to remove all of the references to props. So I can remove that here and here. And now I'm good. I can even remove this argument props since I'm not using it anywhere, but it doesn't really matter. So now let's verify that our app works. I can click add to cart, shows up in my cart. I can click on the cart. Hey, there's my book. And remove from cart doesn't work yet, but we'll do that. Before I get to those stretch items, I want to stop and see if we have any questions. All right. Sounds like everyone is good with this so far. So I've heard from a couple of you like, oh, context is so much easier than props. Why would I ever use props before? And I'm a little bit confused by it because they're basically the same thing. I mean, not in terms of the ability to share stuff, but the way in which we define them. So we're giving this value here. We're setting its value equal to an object where we define keys and a value. If we were to pass this as props, to something like cart, or I'm sorry, to navigation, right? The value on our provider is a key name of cart and a value of the variable cart. And if we were to pass that as a prop to navigation, we would give it a key called cart and a value of cart. And then inside of navigation, it would receive as an argument props, which is an object, which is a collection of all of the individual props that I had added to this component. The same way that value, when we call useContext, returns an object. And it contains all of the individual key value pairs that I had put inside of that object. We even destructure it in the exact same way, because that's a JavaScript thing. That's not a props thing. So I'm happy that it seems to be connecting with some of you, but it's very, very, very similar to the existing system for props, where things are specified in key value pairs. They wind up in an object, and then we can either destructure or access the properties of that object. So let's do the stretch. So our first stretch item is to get remove from cart working. So we're going to go into app.js, and I want to define a function called remove item. And this is going to take an ID as an argument, because we need to know the ID of the book that we want to remove in order to find it. And I want to update the value of my cart variable so that it no longer contains books with that ID. So I can do that by calling setCart and then giving it an array that no longer contains books with the ID that remove item was given. So we can do that by filtering our cart. And this is going to get us an item. And I want to filter all of the items where the ID is equal to the one on the item. So my filter callback returns true for items we want to keep and false for items we don't want to keep. So I want to return false whenever the item's ID is equal to my argument ID. And I can do that by saying item.id does not equal the ID I was given as the argument. So I want to keep all of the books that don't have this matching ID. But how do I get this down to the places that need it? Well, I can add it to my context. The place we're going to be using it is inside of our navigation, and navigation consumes the cart context, we can see here. So I can add my remove item function to that context value, and then I can destructure it from the object that is returned by useContext. Or I'm sorry, we don't want this in navigation. What am I doing? We want this inside of shopping cart. And shopping cart consumes from cart context. I'm going to destructure the remove item value from the object that is returned by calling useContext. And then I still want to pass it as prompts. I'm not going to hook up the shopping cart item that is rendered when I go over to my cart to context, because you don't want to hook up every single component to context. That's going to end up with a lot of extra re-rendering. And props are still a valuable tool. Context is great for kind of sharing this information around without using props, but it doesn't replace the need for props. We can reuse our item and just change the data that it's given via props without having to reconfigure its insides with context. One of the problems with context is that whenever we use context inside of a component, we're inherently making it less composable, because this now explicitly depends on this cart context value. I couldn't just copy and paste this into another application. I would also have to recreate the context object and then recreate the provider, and then it would work. But something like the cart item that I have here doesn't really need to be concerned about how context works. I can just pass it in data via props. This makes this component nice and reusable, which is exactly how it should be. Our component should be dumb wherever's possible. Context is smart, which allows us to do very nice, complicated things in a very expressive, easy way, but it makes our components less dumb, which makes them less reusable. So I want to keep item dumb. So I'm going to give it a prop called remove item, and I'm going to give it the remove item function that I got from my context as its value. And so this is defined within shopping cart item. So let's look in there. So my shopping cart item, when reformatted, has a button ready for us to use to remove the items from cart. So when we click on this button, what I want is to call props dot, what did I call it? Remove item. But this needs the ID of my item as an argument in order to know which book to remove. If I leave it in like this, when we click on this button, it will call props.remove item, and it will give it the event as an argument. That's not what we want. We want to ignore the event, and instead call props.remove item with the ID of the current book. So now, I should be able to add some items to my cart, and then remove them from my cart. So, any questions with how I implemented that? All right, feeling good about removing items. So then the second stretch was to get my cart to persist between reloads. And we can do that using local storage. And where we're going to do that is where we control the value of our cart inside of app. Context doesn't change where our state is managed necessarily. It just changes how we pass these values around. So I'm still going to do this where I declare and use cart. So the way that local storage works is that I can get an item out of local storage using local storage dot get item, and then giving it the key of the item that I want. In this case, cart is what I'm going to decide to call that item in my local storage. So if this exists, then I want to parse its value, because we can only store strings in local storage, remember. So we use JSON.stringify when we input the value of our cart into local storage. And when we get it out, we're going to have to parse it. And if this isn't in local storage, then I'm going to just want to use the empty array. So let's do that. And I already have a hint set up here with my ternary operator. So if cart is in local storage, then I'm going to want to parse it. So local storage dot get item cart, and then I want to ship this off as an argument to JSON.parse. So I want to parse this out of local storage, out of the string, and back into a JavaScript array. But if that doesn't exist, then I still just want to use my empty array as the default value for my cart. So now, nothing's changed. If I add some stuff to my cart, and then I refresh, it all gets removed. And that's because while I'm checking to see if my cart is in local storage, I'm never putting it in there. We could do that when our application starts. We can use some tricks leveraging the DOM API in order to save it into local storage right before the browser window closes or is refreshed. But fundamentally, the idea behind what we want to do is whenever the value of our cart changes, we want to save that. And in this case, we're deciding to save it inside of local storage instead of, sending it off to some API. So I want to run some code every time the value of cart changes. What tool have the React gods blessed us with to run code whenever some value changes? My best friend in the whole world, useEffect. Yay! So I can just set up a useEffect, and whenever the value of cart changes, I am going to call local storage dot set item and give it the key that I want to put the value under, and then the value that I want to place in there. And I can't give it cart directly because cart is not a string, so I have to stringify it. So now, this needs to be in the dependency array. There we go. So now, whenever I add items to my cart, they show up in my cart. This useEffect is going to run, and when I refresh my page, they're still there because they were saved within my local storage. All right, any questions with the way I did this? Oh, very few questions today. All right.
Yeah, Henry, I have a question about
Mm-hmm.
the use context in conjunction with use reducer.
Okay, yeah. What's your question?
Yeah, so basically, with what we learned today with use reducer, we're updating the state using by dispatching the actions.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reducer function is going to return an object that's going to replace our reducer state.
Yes.
And so how do we use that in conjunction with the context? Use context. Like I'm a little confused about how those two tie in together.
So when we provide our context, we specify the value that we want to have it provide. And so we could put in there our state. And we could also put in there any associated functions that we've written in order to dispatch actions, which are consumed by our reducer and update state. So there really isn't anything special going on. The context just allows us to provide values to any components within our component tree below the provider, and so we can give the values that we're generating for use with our reducer to the context provider.
So do you recommend setting the value of the use context should we set the values to the dispatch functions from the use reducer, or just like declare it in the component where we're trying to dispatch the action?
It depends. There are different patterns here that you may or may not want to use. I would prefer to declare my dispatches in a kind of centralized place, and then pass them to the different components that I'm using, whether it's via props or whether it's via context, rather than to give my components the dispatch function and have them write the logic in there. Because part of what the reducer pattern enables us to do is to, write our dispatch functions such that our components are dumber. The component doesn't really have to care about the implementation of these things. And so we can give it to them via props or via context. In some cases, you might want to give a component the dispatch function. Maybe it's because declaring all these functions in app.js has gotten unwieldy and there's just too many in there. Or, maybe you actually want to declare your dispatch functions in some other kind of method that you can see people doing where they kind of recreate the Redux-like API that we're going to be using tomorrow, using context and the use reducer function, and creating a component that contains the provider but also the state and the functions that are going to perform dispatches and all of that. But yeah, just different patterns to try out.
So if we, one possible pattern would just be to declare the use reducer in the actual app, and then provide the state and the dispatch to the value of the context, and then whatever component needs it, we'll just hand it off.
Yeah, that is absolutely
Okay.
one option. The drawback with that option is it gives you a lot of power in terms of, like, any component can dispatch any action, and that's great. But the problem then comes from the maintainability of how do you keep track of what components are doing what, because you've essentially given the master key to your entire state to literally every single component that you render. And part of that problem might be solved in, like, oh well, we only put the provider for this subset of components so that it's more manageable. Another solution is to instead write all your dispatch functions and then provide those. So different trade-offs. All right. Let's see. Vanessa asked a question in Slack. Sorry, I'm a little confused. Could you repeat what you said about passing values from our state into provider? I may be way off of what you said too. So when we're doing the reducer pattern from today, we end up with something that looks like state and dispatch. They're being defined when we call use reducer, and we give it our reducer function and then the initial value. So these are just variables, right? These are just two variables. One of them is an object, our state, and the other one is a function, dispatch. If we want to pass these as props, we can. Nothing's stopping us from passing values as props. These state and dispatch are variables. I'm allowed to do this. And in the same way that I can pass any values that I want as props, I can pass any values that I want via context. So I could pass state and dispatch via my context. So state and dispatch, just two more values coming from a different source. This time I use reducer hook, but both context and props do not care. They just accept these values. And what I was talking about with Amir is you can pass your state to everything this way, which is pretty neat because we know state is immutable and it doesn't really matter what needs what. They can just grab whatever they need out of there. That's neat. But when we give it this dispatch function, this is basically broad administrative power to dispatch any action which can modify any part of our state, which is good because it gives us a lot of power and leeway to do what we want. But we can also do things like const, do something. And this is going to be a function which is going to call dispatch, and it's going to produce an action of type, do something. And maybe it has some payload, maybe it doesn't. And then we could give this, do something to our context or, via our props. Again, context makes it easy to avoid situations where you have prop drilling or kind of an unorthodox pattern of needing to get data between different components, but it doesn't replace our need to pass props. So we could also just pass do something as a prop. And now whatever component we've passed this function as a prop to is unaware that this contains a reference to dispatch and doesn't, modify a variable with set state. Our component is dumb. Gets the function, triggers it on a button click or a form submit or an input event. It doesn't matter. And then it calls it. And our component is none the wiser that we have changed our backend from, use state to use reducer, and the world keeps on spinning. All right, do we have any other questions?
So if with the use reducer hook, this pattern, the idea is like we can just declare it in the component where we want to, I guess, utilize the reducer. I mean, that's another pattern as well. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, could you say that again? I didn't entirely understand what you meant.
Okay, so the use reducer pattern, I'm just trying to compare it to like the you know the Redux way of doing it.
Yeah.
So the use reducer, the difference is like we can just actually declare it in any functional components if we want to use reducer functionality.
Yeah. So Redux is a library that's set up to kind of manage your entire component state within the reducer pattern and some accoutrement necessary to set that up. What the use reducer hook does in isolation is it's kind of a drop-in replacement for use state, where we have these individual variables, products and cart, and as the number of state variables we're declaring in app or anywhere else starts to creep up and up and up, and we write these more complicated functions that, perhaps when we call them set multiple values and multiple ones of these state variables or kick off other actions that modify other things, we start to generate this kind of tangled web of functionality and variables, and it can be hard to keep track of. What the reducer pattern offers us is a way to kind of calm that down. So our state is all collected into a single object. And then all of the functionality that we write inside of our component is functions that call dispatch. They will dispatch actions of different types and have, different payloads if necessary. And then all of the management of our state, all of the modifications to our state occur inside of our reducer function itself. So instead of this kind of ad hoc network of functions calling set whatever, we can just easily check and see, okay, what does this dispatch, of type do something do? I can check my reducer. Oh, it sets these values in these different places. Okay. So it can help us basically organize the process that we have. Nothing more, nothing less. When we learn the Redux library tomorrow, Redux takes this a step further and is like, well, what if we kind of managed our entire application state that way? And then we could, at any level within our component tree, hook up a component to that state, give it whatever values from that state we wanted to as props, and any functions, any of our dispatcher functions that we wrote as well via props. And then when those are called, those will go through the same pattern of the reducer that we're learning today, but this time it's meant to kind of manage our entire application and help centralize the state for that in one place. This has a nice advantage of kind of centralizing our state, making it easy to pass values between other components without the linear prop method. It can help alleviate prop drilling, as well as kind of making all of our components dumb. They receive all of their functionality in via props. Not all of it, but any functionality that relates to the larger state of our application all comes in via props. So they become much more presentational. They display whatever data they get via props. They trigger the appropriate functions that were given via props. And it has some overhead. You'll see tomorrow there's some hoops you need to jump through in order to get Redux set up. But fundamentally, it's just this pattern that we're learning today with use reducer, that we kind of centralize our state and the management of that state inside of our reducer function. And then the only things we need to trigger inside of our components is dispatching different actions. And the logic of how to resolve those actions is handled entirely within our reducer function. All right. Any final questions here? Okay, cool. Well, thank you all so much for coming by. This concludes another one of our recitations.